In this video, I'm going to discuss the end of the last ice age and get us into the Holocene, which is the period since the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. But before I get to that, I just want to talk briefly about one last species. It's sort of a cousin of ours that has been found recently on the island of Flores. It is it's called Homo floresiensis, but it's a really small version of us, um, and so it has the nickname the Hobbit. Um, you see a reconstruction on your left. I want to just point out with the one on the right below the map. Uh, I just want you to see in the little black skulls right under the word concerning, just to give you an idea of the difference in size of these skulls. Below that, they sort of show them the same size, but that's so you can compare things. But in fact, they were much smaller than we are, and seem to have made it right up to the end of the ice age, and were isolated from us and sort of evolved in a different manner. Uh, the site is on the island of Flores. You can see it there on the bottom near Komodo, and so just to give you an idea of where this site is in Southeast Asia. Uh, and we get a view of the wonderfully big cave in which this new species of ours was found. And here are some other shots of it. These are people holding the adult male skull, right? And you can see on the left how much smaller, the top left, how much smaller the skulls are compared to ours. Much smaller. And one of the things that happens here, and I'm going to talk more about this later on because this is a subject that I'm very interested in, is that when animals get to islands and they're not being hunted, they they dwarf. They get smaller as they go on because as they evolve because they have limited food supply being on an island, and the smaller they are, the less they need. And it's over the long run, it's easier to survive if you're small. Now, is this what happened with humans? It's probably not that straightforward, but they seem to have been isolated from the Homo sapiens and evolved in a different trajectory and became quite small. A lot more research is being done on this. This is a really sort of exciting research on the last decade or so of this, and I'm sure you'll probably see more about this in the news. Back to now, let's get to the end of the ice age and get into what's called the Mesolithic. I put this fun a little slide up here. And it says, you can see what it says. They do say they domesticated dogs. That's sort of true, but because dogs are the earliest of domesticated animals, but there isn't real domestication of other species until after the Mesolithic into the Neolithic. And we're getting into this very sort of a period where it's going to be a warming trend in the Mesolithic. That's because it's the beginning of the Holocene, and we'll see our adaptation change. So the Mesolithic is the middle Stone Age, right? Lithic stone. And Meso middle. The Paleolithic was the Old Stone Age, and that's from the last ice age and everything before. And then after the Mesolithic, we become farmers. That changes on where we live. But when we become farmers, it becomes what we call the Neolithic. And we can see this diagram here showing these phases for Western Europe. So notice the middle one there says late Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, and then the Bronze Age. Well, in the New World, in North America, they use different phrasings and different. And they have different dates because things happen differently there. So you can see Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and then farming. So we'll have two different terminologies as we go through the class. But for right now, I want you to pay attention to what it says on the second from the left, where it says Pleistocene and Holocene. And we're going to be moving into the Holocene at this point in time. And with this, you can see on the far left bar how we enter into this warming trend that we continue to be in right now. And as I think I mentioned in a previous lecture, we're basically right now just in what's called an interglacial period, where it's in a warming trend, but it'll eventually get cold again because of the wobbling of the Earth's the axis of the Earth. And I showed you this before. But what's interesting is that in the Holocene, a lot happens to us or by us, and we will see we become farmers, and then we become metallurgists, and we start living in complex societies, and building and making a lot more. And so I'll keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the semester. I do want to point out here that one of the things that happens in history, the long-term history, is we make this transition from hunter-gatherers into farmers. And as we will see, the farming in Europe takes off in the Fertile Crescent. That's around the Middle East and northeastern Africa. There'll be another farming revolution in the New World, and we'll discuss those. But the practice of farming is pretty late in the game. And when we get to the Neolithic, I'll talk about what that means, what the domestication of animals and plants means. But we enter in this trajectory of becoming farmers starting about 8,000 in the Middle East, and the practice spreads and slowly replaces hunter-gatherers to the point that on the very bottom, see, there are hardly any hunter-gatherers left. There's on that map it shows none basically. There still are some in the Amazon, but not many. And farming takes up a lot more land and pushes hunter-gatherers away. We will talk more about that as we get into that period, but keep in mind that for the majority of our history, we were hunter-gatherers, and indeed our bodies evolved as hunter-gatherers. You probably have heard that, why do we consume so many carbs? And people will say, well, it goes back to our Ice Age ancestors. And that's true. They were nomads. They walked around a lot, and they weren't producing their own food. So their bodies learned to hold on to the carbs as long as possible because they're energy. But once we become farmers, we start producing high carb foods. And then, as we'll see when we get into the urban revolution and people start taking jobs that don't require as much physical labor, et cetera, these carbs have an effect on us. And so that's how when they say we get this problem with obesity due to our Ice Age ancestors, that's what they mean. Okay, and with this warming trend, obviously the sea levels will rise, and the sea level, and the sea will change to a great extent because there's more fresh water in it. Basically, what happens is the following: the glaciers melt, and they melt dramatically, and the sea levels rise. At one point during a very serious glacial event, the sea levels were something like 300 meters lower than they are now. And that's a lot. That's a lot to think about. I think I mentioned in an earlier class, if you remember those maps of the world and it shows the continental shelves, well, at these times of great glaciations, those continental shelves were exposed. That's how low the water was. But the water's been creeping up ever since, and becoming is less saline, more water, and as we'll see, there is also a move to greater consumption of marine resources at this time. uh, I just want to point out that some of the terrestrial mammals that are being hunted. Just to point out that they are, these are animals with a lot of meat on them. Um, and so it's not just the marine resources. The marine resources are added on, are in addition to these animals, especially a place like Starcar in England, which is surrounded by water, and they had to take advantage of that as well. I do want to point out too that skeletal studies or faunal analysis is very important. We'll talk more about it later in the class. But if any of you are very interested in biology, there is a spot for you in archaeology, but you have to be able to identify different bones of different animals, and it takes a pretty good eye to know how to do that. And here we see another this same sort of graph for Eland's Bay in South Africa. And we can see the change over time for for what animals are being consumed. Now, this goes to pretty recently, and that's because the Mesolithic phases, are at different places at different times. And even if it isn't, even if it's going down to uh, uh, well into a farming period. The important thing to keep in mind is that notice, for example, the fur seal becomes a lot more dominant as a species uh, that is, hunted and eaten. So it is a marine resource. Things like the mole rat just fall off completely, and then other, small bovids, etc., are consumed as well. The important one is the increase in the fur seal. There's several ways we can, tell what animals they eat. Well, the primary one is looking at the bones. The seeds are a bit more difficult. The plants, there are seeds that are found at sites in flotation devices. I believe I talked about that. But they can also, specialists can study these by looking at isotopes and in our bone, and get a basic idea of what sort of plants, etc., we were consuming. Uh, Here is a map of what's called the Jomon culture. This is in Japan, uh, late Pleistocene, early Holocene, and it just shows you that the animals and plants that they were eating were seasonal. They changed over time, of course, and they were far more dependent um, on seasons. I shouldn't say dependent, but things, their food changed a lot from season to season. In our world, we can get whatever we want at any time of the year. It's interesting though. When I was younger, I did live in, you know, some parts of the world where that wasn't the case, and yeah, your diets changed depending on what was available at that time, and so we see this sort of mapped out here. In the summer, a lot of fish, and in the winter, a lot more hunting of large mammals, and and then different plants for the spring versus different plants for the autumn, etc. It is interesting though that they were very aware of of the world around them, and were very good at exploiting it. And by the way, one interesting thing is that they had a far more varied diet than we do now. When we become farmers, we focus in on certain plants and animals, basically the ones we can domesticate. And once again, I'll come back to this idea later on. Um, but here we just see, that there are these seasonal changes. Another thing that emerges with the Mesolithic is we start getting cemeteries. Now, I mentioned the skeleton of the Neanderthal Shanidar cave, but we really don't have, multiple burials anywhere. As hunter-gatherers, they seem to just, when people died, they just died. I don't know. We don't know what the hell they did with them. And if they're accidentally preserved for us, that's great. Uh, but now we start getting burials. And we can see here the Mesolithic cemetery from Vaalbeek. And this one is quite a Vedbeck, I should say Vedbeck. Um, this is a of a man and a woman, and notice that there is a small child in between them. You can sort of barely make it out there. Uh, and on the right, she wears a necklace of a tooth pendant, so she's wearing jewelry, and he has a nice knife associated with him, or bone point. Um, and this was used for cutting or perhaps warfare, and so we can see this idea of the burial goods in this, to a great extent reflect the person. So we start getting things like this: burials and then burial goods with them, indicating some sort of belief in the afterlife or something. If they feel that they should have things like their necklace with them or a knife with them, um, and it shows far greater symbolic behavior and symbolic understanding. Um, and that's a big shift. I mean, pretty much we're saying they probably even believe in a deity at this point. I want to talk about the site of Lipinski Vir, here in the very center of the map here along the Danube, up in the Carpathian Mountains. This is a really exciting Mesolithic site. It has a whole bunch of sort of tent-like structures. We just have the foundations for them. But notice that they have a fan shaped, and they're all looking out at a river's edge there, and so it shows some sort of customary practice by which to make their dwellings. There's not much, preserved of them. This was very, careful and tight excavation. But it's fascinating, and they're producing great artifacts, and they found burials as well around the houses, and so that's another new thing of the idea of burying people at the house will start to emerge. And the fun thing is that it has a bunch of crazy sculptures all around it. These stone-made, apparently man-faced individuals who have sort of an unhappy or grimacing look on their face. Here's a better example of this guy here. What's going on is unclear. Notice that they're round on the bottom, so they just sort of were pushed into the ground. His hands coming to his chest, and then he is crying. Are they mourners at the burial? It's hard to know. But it is interesting that we're getting these stone sculptures now, of and figural ones at that, of humans, and these are at burials. And here yet is another example, crude in some ways, but nevertheless showing that the artwork is associated with these burials, and so there was a lot of thinking about the afterlife in these societies. And here are some shots of them in situ next to a burial. And so more examples of that house we can see on the top with a burial underneath it, and another shot of that on the bottom, just so you can give you an idea of the association between the structures and the burials. And we get even crazy burials like this one, where the legs are sort of pulled up in between or close up to the pelvis. It's hard to know exactly what's going on there. But they're managing the body somehow, maybe to fit into this specific tomb, or something. What's sort of gruesome about this is that they would probably, in order to get those legs to flex that way, after the person has died, they probably had to cut, through the tendons around the knees, etc. So that's telling us a bit more of their practices at the time. And so we'll end there with introducing the Mesolithic, and on the next lecture we'll have a nice discussion of more of the Mesolithic and get farther into the Holocene.